Hello and welcome to our new webinar series. We're going to do a new webinar every couple of weeks about a cybersecurity topic. This is the first one and it is called Your Security Awareness Training Sucks. What we're looking at doing in these webinars is picking a cybersecurity topic and then giving hints and tips about how you can make that aspect of your cybersecurity strategy more effective. So this is coming from the work that we deliver. It'll be a range of topics from cybersecurity testing right up to things like security awareness training. And where we're getting the content from is lessons that we've learned through delivering these types of services, talking to customers, or in the case of training, things that we've found out by talking to delegates. So hopefully it should be an entertaining and educational series of hints that can help you with these topics. We're starting with security awareness training because it has recently been Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And definitely during that month, I saw an awful lot of tips that were honestly just not great, either lacking critical context or just outdated, not relevant to people today. So I wanted to put together a webinar that I can hopefully help you out if you're looking at using security awareness training to bolster the security of your organization against things like phishing threats, those kinds of things. So, for those who don't know who I am, my name's Holly Grace Williams, and generally I'm known for my work in pen testing and for breaking into computers and buildings, but I do also deliver a lot of training, be it technical training, talking to web developers about how to make more secure web applications, talking to sysadmins about how to make more secure networks, or just security awareness training, talking to non-technical staff about how they can stay safe both at work and at home from common cybersecurity threats that might impact them. So, we are looking at cybersecurity awareness training, and I guess I should define a few terms as I go through. What do I mean by awareness training? That might seem obvious at first, but I am going to talk about things like active phishing campaigns, sending emails to your staff members to see if they fall for phishing, and I do consider all of that part of security awareness training. The training is, of course, actively speaking to staff members and giving them the educational content, but it's a good idea to follow up in some way to make sure that that training is effective. And active phishing testing is one way that companies may choose to do that. There is, of course, some problems with active phishing testing. That is why it is included within this content. But when we talk about security awareness training, for us, when we deliver training, we're talking to staff members about a range of cybersecurity risks and how to avoid those risks or how to mitigate them. But also, I think something that gets missed from a lot of security awareness training is talking to staff members about good practices, talking to staff members about technologies, practices, processes that can help them. Very often you'll see security awareness training that focuses on things like weak passwords, but then doesn't talk to staff members about the benefits of things like password managers and multi-factor authentication. Yes, most training will say something blunt like you should use multi-factor authentication, but wouldn't necessarily go into the details of the different kinds, how to use them, how to get them set up, those kinds of things. We'll get to that though. First point is security awareness training should cover the risks and it should not just focus on phishing. I mentioned phishing right at the beginning because, of course, it is a key part of security awareness training. I'm not saying don't talk about it. It is a significant risk for most organizations. But a lot of security awareness training that we come across focuses, I think, too heavily on specifically phishing emails. So, we're going to talk about the content that you can deliver to staff, how to get more out of that content, some things you might have missed, and some potential misconceptions that might come up from your training. You might say something to users in good faith and they may misinterpret it. So we'll talk about some of those misconceptions and how to avoid them. Starting at the beginning though, if we're talking about awareness training, one of the most common risks, of course, is weak passwords. And I cover weak passwords. I'm talking about, vendor default passwords, users choosing bad passwords, reused passwords, all of those kinds of things. But let's just start with the phrase passwords suck and build up from there through some of the problems that come up with passwords right up to multi-factor authentication and how we think you should be talking to staff members about those kinds of things. The first thing though, there is a quiz question in this webinar. I'm not getting you here just to listen to what I'm saying. I want to make sure that you engage with the content. This is a trick question, and I'm giving you the heads up by telling you that this is a trick question, but According to the password strength meter on Microsoft 365 Admin Center, which of the following is the strongest password? Now, this content wasn't originally in this webinar, but yesterday I was setting up some test accounts to gather some of the screenshots for this webinar, and I spotted something unusual. That is why, of course, I'm saying this is a trick question, but I do think it highlights in a really clear way one of the issues with security awareness training. But let's answer that question. So, is the strongest password, according to Microsoft 365 Admin Center, the word password with the digit 1 at the end? Is it a passphrase that is long and unpredictable, something potentially easily remembered by a user if they pick something that's important to them, but unlikely to be in a word list or picked in a dictionary-based attack, that kind of thing? Or is it a random 80-character long string? This is just uppercase and lowercase letters, but it is 80 characters long. So which is the strongest password according to M365? Well, M365 says it's password 1. Now, anyone who's played around with security awareness training, looked at hardening systems against password attacks, will no doubt immediately spot what the issue is here. But just in case you've missed it, M365's password strength meter seems to be putting a lot of weight on password complexity. Now, Microsoft defines password complexity as passwords involving 3 of the 4 uppercase, lowercase numbers, and symbols. So password is complex if it has 3 of those characteristics. Now, the passphrase that I have chosen and the randomly generated password from my password manager only have alpha characters in them, so it's only uppercase and lowercase letters. Granted, the random one at the bottom there is 80 random characters, but it doesn't have a number or symbol in it. So it seems that because of that, Microsoft grades it as a weak password. For those that are curious, yes, if you stick the digit 1 at the end of either of those 2 passwords, it suddenly jumps from weak to strong because it matches the complexity requirement there. But the reason that I pointed this out is not to tell you about strong passwords and not to deliver to this audience some of the details of security awareness training, but it's to point out one weakness that we often see with awareness training, and that is the fact that you might give good guidance to your staff or to your users. However, bad guidance might be more frequently reinforced to them. So they might sit through your lesson, understand what it is that you're saying to them, and then a few days later or a few weeks later, they're seeing things like this, and they're having what are weak passwords reinforced to them. If they're seeing lessons like complexity makes a strong password, then they're missing important context there. Now, there's a couple of ways that you could address this in your security awareness training. If it's the frequency that you're trying to address, then running more frequent training. Not necessarily the full session more frequently throughout the year, but running top-up sessions or running refresher sessions, or just introducing users to new content as things change within the threat landscape. That could be one way of countering the frequent bad guidance that they might see, so that they're less likely to have this negative guidance reinforced to them. Another thing, of course, is within your security awareness training, raise these issues. Your staff members aren't dumb. Okay, they may be non-technical, but I'm sure that if you explained why this has occurred, they would understand it. And that would mean that when they see this happen, they can laugh at it like security professionals do and realize that it's just a silly problem that has occurred from weighing too much on complexity over password length, for example. So explaining these things, explaining to users what complexity is and how it can and importantly cannot help their passwords, why it might seem that a password is strong, company name 123, winter 2022, something like that. Those are bad password choices, but strength meters might unfairly grade them. There's other ways, of course, talking to users about password entropy and those kinds of things. If you've got staff that you think will want to go to that degree, then that's great, but I don't think you need to. I think pointing out these kinds of problems to staff members, explaining how they occur, and importantly explaining how they can avoid this problem is something that should be done. And it's honestly not something that I see come up very often in security awareness training, where there's specific content or a module looking to counter bad guidance. Or maybe talk about things like why complexity is enforced, what its intention is, and maybe covering some things like why does the NCSC and NIST 800-63B say you should not enforce complexity. Those are important lessons too, and your staff members can understand them if you run them through it. So yeah, you know what? Passwords versus passphrases. I could put a whole amount of content into my opinion as a security professional as to what makes the most secure password, whether you should go for a longest passphrase possible, whether you should do something like the NCSE's 3 random words, where you're just picking words completely at random, whether you should be looking to pick unlikely words like your favourite star, favourite Greek philosopher, and favourite medical condition, as I have picked for this bottom example here. But this isn't what we're trying to get to in this particular webinar. We just want to point out the fact that very often security awareness training does not counter bad guidance that they might see, and disappointingly might see even during things like Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So, something to consider. There are, of course, other common issues with awareness training, not just the fact that there's a lot of bad guidance out there. So some of the common training issues that we see is content not tailored for the target audience. There's a couple of ways that content should be targeted to the audience, in my opinion. We'll get to that in a second, but tailored content is going to be more effective than generic content, and it's going to allow you to go into more depth about the specific aspects most likely to impact your audience. Outdated content. We're always going to get this. And missing critical context. Missing critical context is a key point, especially when it comes to outdated content. I think these two go together. If something has changed in the threat landscape, in the way that attackers are targeting organizations, or if we've just gathered more data about a protection and realized it's stronger or weaker than we thought it was, that's something important to tell users. If the guidance this year is different to the guidance last year, explain to them why that is, why that previous guidance is no longer considered accurate, it's outdated, and make sure that they understand those details. Missing critical context can also be around things like, I just mentioned, some password strength meters put too much weight on complexity. Some guidance says you shouldn't enforce complexity at all. There's other examples of those kinds of things. Some guidance mandates password rotation, for example, PCI DSS 3.2.1. At the time of recording, the current latest version mandates password rotation, whereas the NCSE says you shouldn't mandate password rotation. Password rotation, if you're unfamiliar with that term, being enforcing a password change after an arbitrary amount of time. So every 90 days you make users change their password. There's a lot of best practice guidance that's now saying you shouldn't do that, although previously in some instances, and still for some guidance like the example of PCI, do mandate it. Explaining that context to users can be important. If you haven't come across the idea that you shouldn't enforce password rotation, one of the weaknesses there being users choosing passwords based on patterns. So they might start using passwords like winter 2021, spring 2022, summer 2022, those kinds of things, and changing their password based on some detail because of rotation. Or maybe even something very simple like password 1, password 2, password 3, and not making as good password choices as you potentially thought they were. If you're just coming into that kind of thing, dealing with password rotation and alternative mitigations, best thing to do is think, what is the risk that you are trying to mitigate with that protection, and is there other ways, other better ways of mitigating that risk? But there's a lot of words to say. There's a lot of common weaknesses with training, so let's step through a couple of them. Common weakness that I see all the time is untailored content. So what I'm referring to here is a company coming to a training provider such as ourselves and then saying, oh, please give our staff security awareness training. And we can do that, but something that we would definitely prefer to do is tailor our training to the guidance that your organization is giving. We want to understand what is your security policy so that we make sure that the content covers some important details. For example, if you allow or require staff to use a password manager, great. Which one? So that we can make sure that we have content in our training about the proper use of that particular product. Or if you have some restriction that prevents users from using certain controls, maybe, for example, you are a company that falls under PCI DSS and you have to enforce rotation, giving the context that we just covered to users as well so that they understand the situation. So content should be tailored to the organization. Now there's a separate rant to be had on this around, in my experience, I do a lot of maturity reviews with companies. So sitting down and looking broadly at the organization's security stance, everything from security policies, how you design security, right down to how it is implemented and how you deal with incident response, those kinds of things. One of my big takeaways from doing a large number of maturity reviews is most companies' security policies suck. I haven't planned a webinar for your security policies suck yet, but if you would like to see that, I would love to put one together. I think it would be a difficult sell for the marketing team of like, hey, come and listen to me rant about security policies for 30 minutes. But I do think there's a lot of important details there. One of the surprisingly common yet really dumb things that we come across is security policies that are marked as being regularly reviewed, sometimes marked as being reviewed by several people, and yet there's significant failings in the policies. And I'm not talking about the nuance of policy clauses, I'm talking about things like this policy clause does just not make sense. It is such poor English that it is ambiguous. Those kinds of things. Clauses that are unfinished, clauses that don't make sense, clauses that are ambiguous. Two clauses within policy documents that counter each other, all kinds of problems. So yes, content should be tailored, but if you're going to do that, you should probably make sure that the guidance you give to your training provider is good. Or maybe it's time to do a security policy review if you haven't done one for a while. Yeah, but let me know as well if you want to hear me rant about security policies. It sounds like a boring thing, but there's a huge amount of guidance that we get just from doing it so frequently, and I'd like to share it with you. Another way that training should be tailored, in my opinion, is to the role of the audience. So this isn't necessarily every role that you have within your organization, but I do think there's some key roles, maybe HR, finance, and IT, who should receive different training to other people. You could do that as baseline training that everybody receives and then an add-on module for specific roles or something like that to make ease of delivery. But I do think that there are certain roles who should have role-specific training. I think my best argument for this would be, do you think your IT team should receive the exact same training as everybody else within your organization? Personally, I don't, and I think not only do those teams have a stronger foundation in the technical details, so we can go a little bit more in depth, but also they just face different risks. One of the things actually that comes up when we talk about social engineering, or I guess comes up more strongly when we do social engineering, is very often when people think or talk about phishing attacks and those kinds of things, sending malicious messages to coerce users, they think that we're just going to generically target the organization or we're going to send the email to just anyone. Very often when we're doing social engineering as part of our security testing, we will specifically target IT teams. For example, we could do something like try and convince a member of the IT team to reset a password for an account we're not supposed to have access to. So the IT team have different risks to the rest of the organization, and in my opinion should receive at least an add-on module for their specific role. Also, sometimes it's interesting to go into other areas of security hygiene in general, patches, password management, vulnerability management, those kinds of things that we wouldn't cover with everyone, of course. An example of something that I might talk to a technical team about, this is definitely something that I might talk to a software development team about, is how and why some protections work. So that if you have policies that say things like, oh, we use captures or other anti-automation techniques to prevent certain kinds of attacks, I can talk to those IT teams about what makes those protections effective. And here is a real example of a weakness that I spotted in an application recently. Hopefully everybody knows what a capture is, right? There's been different kinds, but generally it's an anti-automation technique where we present to the user some question that generally users can answer easily, but computers may struggle with. Now, what computers struggle with changes over time thanks to machine learning, but it's something like this you see on the screen here. We might present a series of images to the user and ask them to identify some aspect of the image. Which of the images have cars in them? Which of the images have crosswalks in them? I don't think within the UK we typically use the term crosswalks, but I think most people know what they are. And the idea here being, if you're protecting something like a login page from brute force attacks, this is one mechanism to do that. Okay, login pages can have other protections like account lockout, but there's some places where captures are just a good mechanism. Contact us pages to prevent spam is another one to think about. And this is an example of a pretty good capture, or right now it is. As computers get better at image recognition, I'm sure these will become weaker. Here's an example that I actually saw within an application that is not a good example of a capture. I don't know if you know this, but computers are really good at arithmetic. So asking a computer or a human, a question like this isn't going to make it easy for you to distinguish whether it is a human being at the keyboard. These are the kinds of things that we might dig into if I'm talking to a software development team. I might talk about vulnerability management if I'm talking to an IT team. We can go in different directions and we can give them more tailored guidance to their role if that's something that we're allowed to do. So as you're looking at your plan for delivering security awareness training, consider which roles might benefit from role-specific training. I mentioned a couple of times phishing as well, and other spam content like messages to contact forms and those kinds of things. I said security awareness training shouldn't focus too much on phishing and in particular phishing emails, and I do stand by that, but to be clear, phishing and phishing emails are a real risk that a large number of organizations face, and they're low cost to an attacker, generally speaking. They can send a bunch of phishing emails out, and if people fall for it, then great, I'll compromise some accounts. Low cost to the attacker. But a weakness with security awareness training is the fact that, well, there's other kinds of social engineering. I could message staff members on social media. I could call staff members if they have publicly disclosed phone numbers, or if I can find them through some of the means. I could meet staff members at events if they're talking about going to conferences or something like that. I could go to those conferences specifically with the purpose of interacting with them for the purpose of social engineering. So if you are talking about phishing and social engineering risks, you need to be a bit broader than just phishing emails. And also, you should probably be a bit broader than just talking about things like malicious emails and links. Those are risks, definitely. We see it all the time where a malicious email is sent just with a bad attachment or something like that, and it's just malware. It doesn't have to be, though, and the first message the user receives from the threat actor might not be the one that includes the payload. We could send several emails with the intention of setting up a rapport with a staff member and then send them the payload. Or it could be the case that we just ask them to do something. We coerce them into performing an action as opposed to disclosing information. So, as I mentioned earlier, something like asking a member of the IT team to change a password on an account so that we can do account takeover isn't just email attachments and links that you have to be concerned about. One more thing, though. I mentioned active phishing campaigns. So that is sending phishing emails to your own staff, or emails that look and feel like phishing emails, to see how many of your staff fall for it. This can be useful if done right for checking the effectiveness of security awareness training, that kind of thing. It can also be done as a mechanism to ensure that staff constantly think about phishing as opposed to only think about it whenever you deliver training. For some companies, that might be once a year, and in some cases, even less frequently, like when the person is hired and never again. But active phishing campaigns can be a good mechanism of making sure that phishing is at the top of everybody's minds. The issue is vanity metrics. And what I'm talking about with vanity metrics is where the susceptibility metric that you're gathering might not be telling you what you think it is. So where this basically comes from is not every phishing campaign will have the same base likelihood of somebody falling for it. If I send a very good phishing email or a very bad phishing email, the number of people who fall for that email will differ regardless of the training that you have had. So if you're specifically looking to measure how effective your training is, you need to put a bit of thought into it. Another way of putting that would be, if you're a security professional and you want to have a promotion, or you want to make it look like your security awareness training is very, very good, it is easy to game these metrics. So you could send one email that is quite difficult to detect. You've put a lot of time into it. Maybe you set up fake social media accounts. Maybe you do things like using AI-generated profile pictures so that it looks like there's a real person at the other end of the email. Maybe you do things like including phone numbers so the staff member can contact you even though it's a phishing email. And maybe not including within the first email a malicious attachment or a malicious link, but just sending a staging email and then following up and doing a more complex but likely more effective phishing campaign, gather the metric on how many people are susceptible to that, and then send a really easy to spot phishing email with an obviously bad attachment, not customized to the user at all, from a generic company. Dear valued customer, there is a problem with your bank account, or something like that. Now, hopefully everybody can see here that you would get different metrics from those two, and intentionally or hopefully unintentionally, that can impact your metrics. So it's something to be aware of. If you are gathering metrics about how effective your awareness training is through the mechanism of active phishing tests, you need to put a lot of thought into that to make sure that the comparisons you're making are in fact effective, so that you can be clear about how effective the training actually is. Another thing when it comes to active phishing testing, or even just response to real phishing emails, is just because staff members are reporting phishing emails does not mean that all of your staff have a good level of security awareness. So I hear this very often again when I do maturity assessments, and we'll talk about things like security culture. How does your organization grade the culture of security for your staff members? A really, really difficult thing to do. But one of the reasons that I like asking about grading security culture is it often brings out some problems in how the organization is assessing their awareness training and their awareness in general. And that would be where a company says something like, we receive reports of phishing emails, therefore our staff are aware of phishing emails and are good at spotting them. Hopefully in isolation like this, you can see what the problem is. But just to be clear, how from this statement would you know that all users are good at spotting emails and not just a small amount of users? And how do you ensure that they're good at spotting all phishing emails and not just a small subset of scenarios? You easily could fall into a problem like this with your active phishing testing. If you're sending the same kind of scenario every time, your Facebook account has locked, your Gmail account is locked, your Twitter account is locked. Yes, staff might have a good level of awareness of that kind of scam, but there's a wide variety of scams out there. So be careful of how you are grading security culture and how you are ensuring the effectiveness of training. It takes a lot of thought. And don't put too much on some staff members reporting phishing if it isn't broad across the company. So that's phishing, and really the takeaway for phishing is, yes, it's an important risk, but make sure that you're being broad enough with the topic. And also, if you're using guidance mechanisms like active phishing training, it's easy to unintentionally game them. And we've talked about phishing, we've talked about passwords, and very often when it comes to phishing and passwords, the response to those things is, oh, multi-factor authentication solves this problem. And I don't want to say that it doesn't. Passwords suck. We opened with that. Passwords suck and users are bad at choosing them. And multi-factor authentication is a control that can be very beneficial in reducing the risk of weak passwords. The problem is multi-factor authentication isn't a single thing. There's lots of different kinds of multi-factor authentication. And giving simple one-line guidance to staff members like, you should enable multi-factor authentication, is potentially not useful. Do they know how to do that? Do they understand the steps for the major pieces of software they're likely to be using? And also, if given an option, which one should they pick? So again, just digging in a little bit more into the background, the context, that's important. So multi-factor authentication is not a single type of protection, and without going too in-depth into all of the different kinds and some of the strengths and weaknesses, a few examples. Knowledge-based questions. Actually, to be clear here, I don't generally consider knowledge-based questions to be multi-factor authentication. This would be, you see it a lot with banks and things like that, where they maybe ask, what is your password? And then what is your secret word? And for me, if you're using the same factor twice, that's two-step authentication, not two-factor authentication. But I wanted to include it in here as just an example of something that maybe is not giving you the protection that you think it is, and maybe something to warn users about. If they have the option of something like knowledge-based questions versus TOTP, maybe they should pick something like TOTP. And also knowledge-based questions, it really depends on what the question is, right? Is it likely to be something that you can get from social media? Or I actually saw a really great, terrible example of this. A great, terrible example. I was doing a security assessment of a web application, and users could pick a secret question and answer as part of their account recovery process. But the user was able to pick what the question was. And one of the users' accounts that I saw had picked, do I drive a Toyota, as their question. Hopefully everybody can immediately see why that's a bad question. It's a Boolean, right? If I don't get it on the first time, I'm probably going to get it on the second time. So yes, knowledge-based questions. Whilst personally I don't consider them multi-factor authentication, it might be something to talk to users about why they're not great and some of the weaknesses there. But looking at more common types of multi-factor authentication, be it mobile apps that ask you to tap to authenticate, or mobile apps where they send you a time-based code, so you get a code and then every 30 seconds it changes, be it something like where you get a text message, an SMS that includes a code, or something like hardware keys. There's different kinds of multi-factor authentication and they offer different levels of protection. Also, something to consider from a security awareness and good security culture point of view, they also have different levels of convenience. And convenience is a great thing for improving the security of your organization. If users like the security protection, that can be super useful to ensure that they will keep using it and that they'll advocate for the use of it on your behalf. That'll depend on your user base and what your particular options for MFA are, but it's something to bear in mind. If the solution is convenient to use, users are less likely to complain about it. But here, this is something, I wanted to include some photographs of different kinds of multi-factor authentication. So I set up some test accounts and took some screenshots of the mobile device. And on the left-hand side here, you'll see something interesting. This isn't actually something that I set up intentionally. I was just looking for an example of this, and I noticed a quirk. So I have received time-based codes from eBay and time-based codes from Microsoft for Azure, and they've both displayed on my phone under the same account. This account isn't something that I can interrogate as a user on my mobile device. On my iPhone, if I tap verify, it doesn't show me anything. It just shows me a blank account. There's no phone number associated with that. But that might confuse users if they're receiving SMS codes from multiple companies to their phone. That might lead them to think that that is a scam. Maybe it's just a small detail to talk to users about, hey, the fact that this happens, and it's actually legitimate and normal in this instance. So yeah, talking to staff members about SMS-based scams is definitely something you should do. Mobile application-based TOTP and hardware keys, there's a lot of different options out there. Something I wanted to point out though, the big thing about multi-factor authentication that I opened with is they don't all offer the same level of security. Now, no doubt the security professionals listening in will say, yes, of course, SMS-based multi-factor authentication is much weaker than the others. That is true, but I like data-driven arguments and I wanted to present some data to you if you haven't come across this before. Back in 2019, Google, New York University, and the University of California, San Diego spent a year doing research about the effectiveness of multi-factor authentication in preventing account takeover. They also checked knowledge-based questions and showed that, as you would expect, it's not particularly effective, but for mobile application prompts, so things like where it pops up and gives you a 6-digit code, versus security keys, so such as the example I had a YubiKey in the previous photos. There's other physical security keys that exist, but between those two things, they are both very good at protecting against account takeover. But in particular, hardware security keys blocked 100% of assessed account takeovers. So that's not saying that it's 100% effective, but during that year-long research, it was shown to be significantly effective. And I think that's an important data point if you're looking at raising the idea of implementing multi-factor authentication within your organization, or maybe even talking to users about this kind of thing. Hey, we use multi-factor authentication this way because it is so effective. Just a detail I wanted to mention. Another thing on multi-factor authentication, when we talk about how it can maybe not be as effective as we expected. I was doing a security test with an organization. That organization used multi-factor authentication, and that type of multi-factor authentication is what I mentioned, tap to authenticate. This is where a user gets a mobile application notification, pops up on their mobile device, and says, a login is occurring, click here to approve. And if the user clicks to approve, multi-factor authentication may be bypassed. We did this on a security test where we were just lucky. We guessed a username and password combination. The user got the prompt and just hit approve. But we've also seen it through more significant attacks, nation-state-backed attacks, those kinds of things, where they'll attempt authentication several times if they know they've got a good username and password combination. The intention of being popping up on the user's device several times to make it more likely the user will just hit approve to make the messages go away. So abusing tap to authenticate is a thing that can happen. In that particular case that I mentioned on our security test, where a staff member had hit approve, then actually came back to be a security awareness issue. And it's one that was unintentional, but a legitimate issue for that company. When they had implemented multi-factor authentication, they'd sent messages around to staff members with some guidance on how it works, how to install the app, how to get it set up. And there was a message in there that said, effectively, when it pops up and says tap to approve, tap to approve. So the only guidance that that staff member had ever received was when it says click approve, you click approve. He wasn't told anything about why that was happening, what protection it was supposed to be doing, when he might not want to hit approve. If he gets an unintentional notification, a notification that he wasn't expecting, maybe he should report that, and who to. Completely lacked context about that. So the company had done a good thing in implementing multi-factor authentication, but they hadn't backed it up with user training. So that's something to be aware of as well. Is your IT guidance maybe giving bad habits to staff members? Something to be aware of. And closing out here, just to mention within the slide something that I mentioned earlier, which is best practice is not magic, and best practice sometimes contradicts other best practice, and that's something that you'll have to deal with as an organization, both in terms of deciding which guidance you'll follow as an organization, but it also should be something that you bring up in security awareness training so that users don't follow guidance that's against your company's risk appetite or the guidance that you're giving them. The example that I mentioned earlier was PCI DSS. 3.2.1 mandates password complexity and mandates regular password change. Whereas other guidance, such as the NCSC and NIST 800-63B, says you shouldn't do that. Of course, I am now doing the thing that I've told you not to do, which is missing critical context. If you want to read more about the backstory on why the NCSC recommends against these things, I recommend their blog post, Updating Your Approach. It's a good blog post that talks about what they think the weaknesses of these protections and why they recommend against them. But the point here just being, you should talk to staff members about outdated best practice guidance that they might see online that for some reason doesn't apply to your organization because of your context, and also things like some of the messages they might receive during things like Cybersecurity Awareness Month that might be missing critical context or, honestly, in some cases, just wrong. So best practice is not magic. That's the guidance there. And as we start to close out here, a couple of just quick little hints for things that we see people falling foul of. VPNs are also not magic. The reason that I wanted to mention VPNs is we see it in security awareness training where staff members might be told they have to use a VPN or recommended that they should use a company VPN, but it's not really explained to them what a VPN is or how it is protecting the user, and that could lead the user to a false sense of security. There is also some instances of VPN providers previously having maybe overstating the protection that their VPNs provide. So maybe your staff members are seeing things like adverts on YouTube videos, or maybe seeing other advertisements online that are leading them to think that VPNs protect them in ways that they don't. Now, again, to be clear, VPNs are awesome and can benefit organizations in lots of different ways, not only securing communications on untrusted networks, but also things like allowing for easier log management, monitoring activities, looking for potentially malicious activities, those kinds of things. But given some of the advertisements that have happened previously for VPNs, staff members might think they protect them in ways that they don't. So that's an important thing to cover is whether your organization provides a VPN, how they can use it, and specifically in what way it assists the staff member. What is it protecting? I won't call out any particular VPN provider, but previously there has been instances where VPN provider adverts have been banned in their current state. You can see the ruling here as an example. This ad must not appear again in its current form because the advertisement was deemed to be misleading. So again, something to consider with your staff members is covering bad practice and making sure that they're aware exactly how these things protect them. Another one that I haven't mentioned yet, but is similar, would be password managers. Not only talking to staff about how and when they can or should use password managers, but also making it really clear to staff members the areas that password managers cannot protect them. A good obvious example would be if they choose a terrible master password, that's not going to help them. So making sure that that guidance is clear. And the last thing before I quickly summarize everything that I've talked about, maybe unfairly, GDPR is awful. GDPR is onerous on some organizations in some ways. One of the things that I really like talking to technical teams about in their role-specific training is how does your organization implement things like the right to be forgotten? Right to be forgotten can be a tricky one when it comes to backups and things like that. It's another example of role-specific training that we might cover. But just very quickly as we close out, another pop quiz for you and another trick question. So, a data breach has occurred. How much time does GDPR give you to notify your data subjects? Give you a second to think about that. And this is going to be one that I think highlights, hopefully to some people who are listening in, the fact that security awareness training can actually often be misleading, missing critical context, and it might even impact security professionals and people who are supposed to know what they're talking about, IT teams, those kinds of things. So, a data breach has occurred. How much time does GDPR give you to notify data subjects? I ask this question a lot to members of staff, HR, finance, IT teams, members of the executive team, those kinds of things. And very often the answer that I'm given is 72 hours. And that is not the case. GDPR tells you that you must notify the data subject directly and without undue delay. There is no clause that gives you 72 hours. The 72 hours is included, of course, but what that is for is informing the ICO. So I think these two clauses have been conflated in some people's minds, maybe through security awareness training, or maybe just because, you know what, GDPR is a long document and yeah, you might not get everything right. So it's these kinds of details that are important to include within security awareness training. I'm not going to grab anyone's attention by raising GDPR as something you should cover in security awareness training. I get it, regulations can seem really boring, but there are some really important details in there. And if you're not clear with things like your IT team on how your organization handles the right to be forgotten or subject access requests, you're going to have a bad time if you ever have one of those requests. And covering off things that users might have misunderstood, misinterpreted, or have conflated in their heads. Things like this. And that's it. I'll wrap it up there. It's been an hour. So, your security awareness training might have some problems. You might be doing it with the best of intentions, but you know what? Getting it right can be really hard, especially when you're trying to make it interesting, entertaining, and memorable, and cover all of the things that a staff member might have to deal with. But hopefully this webinar has been useful, and we've covered some of the challenges. So if you are looking at delivering security awareness training, either through a provider like ourselves or delivering it in-house, make sure that your training is up to date. Things do change, guidance does change, and giving people outdated guidance isn't going to help them. So make sure your content's up to date. In my opinion, you should be tailoring that to your organization, including details from security awareness training, including details from security policies, so that staff members understand those things. Allowing staff members to ask questions on those things too would be useful. And I also think you should tailor it to the user's role. In the very least, the training that your IT team gets should be different to the training that everyone else gets. And there's probably another couple of roles as well, like maybe HR, finance, and the executive team that should get at least some add-on content. And the big one, I think the most important for me that I see so poorly covered or just so often forgotten about is countering the impact of common false guidance, be it false because it's outdated or just missing context or missing important details. And covering things like, as we opened at the beginning, why password strength meters can sometimes give users a false sense of security or just guide them in the wrong direction. And that's it. Thank you very much for attending our webinar. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll take questions after the fact. If you've got to run though, feel free to email any questions to us you have and we'll follow up. And thanks for attending.